It is Legal Thursdays, where we get to ask the expert about some big cases making headlines right here in the Valley. Now, you may remember this one. 32-year-old James Estep accused of sexually assaulting or kidnapping 6 victims since 2018. And just this year, he was arrested twice. He was released after the county attorney's office declined to file charges in July. And less than a month later, Tempe police say Estep sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl. He was arrested again and held on a $500,000 cash bond. Prosecutors argued for a harsher bond, while Estep's attorney asked for an ankle monitor and house arrest. Ultimately, the judge sided with the state that Estep was not bondable. So Hector Diaz joins us once again for more perspective on this case. Hector, this just sounds so bad in so many ways. I mean, we're talking about a guy who faces 30 felonies. Help us understand why the county attorney did not file charges after the second incident.
So in this case, when ultimately the police department submitted to the county prosecutor, the county would have reviewed this and they had to make a determination on whether or not they had probable cause to charge criminally. The county, and I read some of the statements that were issued by our county attorney in this case, believed, looking at all the evidence, that they just didn't have enough to meet their ethical obligations in this case. And so, I think it's important to note that the county attorney in this case has some unique insight. She's a former sex crimes prosecutor, must have looked at this case and made the decision that it had to go back to the police department to review whether it was, we need more physical evidence. The incompleteness maybe of witness statements, waiting on DNA results.
Right.
And so, the last thing that they want to do is submit a case to a grand jury for, presentment of an indictment and have an incomplete story at that point. Because if they do, ultimately a defense attorney like myself gets the transcript, and I can look at those issues and take advantage potentially of things that otherwise, with a little more time, they could have fixed.
And that's my next question. As a criminal defense attorney, I mean, the fact that, she did not file those charges, I mean, could that have actually helped in his defense?
Well, his defense, given the charges that he's looking at, he's essentially looking at life in prison if he's convicted of all these offenses, given the seriousness and the mandatory prison. So his attorneys no doubt will look at every aspect of this case, and they'll look to see what did the police, what were the issues that led to this being, we call it further, when it's further back to law enforcement for investigation. And they'll look to see, was it, witness statement? Is there something that potentially dealt with maybe a consent issue in terms of, the alleged victim who's making the accusation? And so really they have nothing to lose. So this will be a central piece of their defense.
Okay, let's go on the flip side. How much harder is it for prosecutors to argue their case then?
I think it's going to depend on the evidence that they collected. I think if we're talking physical evidence, if we're talking the collection of DNA, the prosecutors are going to rest on that, right, in terms of being able to match this individual. But if we're talking about, potentially witness statements or, that's really what we're talking, circumstantial evidence, or then it could become an issue for prosecutors going forward. But again, we'll have to see as this develops a little more.
Why was his bond set so low to begin with at $500,000?
So the judge has to make that determination at that hearing with limited information. And even though you're talking very serious charges, the court can't hold this individual non-bondable until there's a more substantive hearing showing that there are really no release conditions that can protect the community from this individual. And ultimately you saw he had a hearing on this issue and the court deemed that, given the severity of what he was accused, that this was an individual that should not get bond at all.
So what happens next for Estep?
He is, no doubt going to proceed with his defense and look at the information. But this is the kind of case where I'm not going to be surprised, unfortunately, that more victims come forward in this matter.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Hector. Of course, Hector will be staying with us again to analyze one more local case that we first told you about on Tuesday, involving 4 high school students who brutally attacked another teenager.